first of all, thank you very much to Farooq and to Bharat and to Sneha and Vinayak for inviting me to give this talk. Let me just share the screens and we can start the presentation. All right, well, again, thank you for joining me today. The talk that I'm giving you today focuses on one aspect of the book, which has just recently been published by Harvard University Press and by HarperCollins India. It's in the form of a biography of Dadabhai Naoroji, the man who was known as the Grand Old Man of India, arguably the first Indian nationalist, someone who mentored people like Gokhale or Gandhi and several other Indian nationalist leaders. Now, the specific talk that I'll give today will be focused on Naroji's connections with the city of Bombay. So, you know, it will not necessarily deal with a lot of his political activity, though I'll mention that in passing. But, you know, just to kind of give you a bit of a refresher, at least, about who Naroji was. So, well, first of all, Naroji lived quite a long life. He lived for about 91 years. He was born in 1825, just a few years after people like Mount Stuart Elphinstone helped consolidate British control in Western India by defeating the remnants of the Marathas. And he died in 1917, just 2 years before Gandhi really started to commence with non-violent, non-cooperationist activities throughout India, and only just a few decades before independence. So it's a very long period of history which Naroji's life encompassed, and he was politically active for a good chunk of them. I mean, out of his 90 plus years, he was politically active for at least 50 or 60 years, and that doesn't include other decades where he was involved in reformist activity in places like Bombay, dealing with, say, social reform activities or other particular activities as well. So the thing that really guided Naroji throughout his life, and really, you know, the most important aspect of his career was his concern for Indian poverty. So I wrote my dissertation when I was in graduate school on Dadabhai Naoroji. And when I entered my PhD program, I, like, I guess, many other people who want to study about South Asia or modern India, asked myself the question, was colonialism more bad than it was good? Which is, I think, a question that a lot of us wrestle with when we look at Indian history, especially those of us who, say, might be on the call today, right? Those of us who are familiar with, you know, who had an English language education, come from relatively more elite backgrounds in India, relatively speaking. So, so by looking at someone like Naroji and his career, I kind of wanted to help myself wrestle with that question as well. And by the time I was done researching Naroji, I realized how absurd that question was. I mean, obviously colonialism was far worse than it was good. I mean, there's no question about it. And Dadabhai Naoroji was really one of the first colonized subjects to really popularize that notion. I mean, many other people obviously came to that conclusion in places like India or elsewhere around the world. But Naroji was really the first person to kind of actively speak up and inform the world, if you will, from a colonial background, that colonialism was evil, in his own words. So throughout his life, he really campaigned a lot to popularize the notion that colonialism was causing poverty in India. He was particularly horrified by famines that swept India in the late 19th century, and that really became kind of his rallying cry. I mean, if you look in Naroji's papers, you'll see images like this on the screen, pictures or drawings at least of famine victims. And it was really this experience that India went through that led to an outpouring of economic work that Naroji undertook during his life, which was encapsulated by a book that was published in the year 1901, his most famous book called Poverty and Unbritish Rule in India. Now, this book is actually a compilation of all his writings on economic topics for about 30 to 40 years. So it's, you know, it's not a standalone book, and it's not something that he produced in 1901 by itself, but it's a compilation of life work. And, you know, in this scholarship, he really presented this idea that India was being drained of its wealth by colonialism, that there was a very active effort on the part of British colonialism to kind of drain away the wealth of India and make it poor. And, you know, to those of us nowadays, that doesn't seem like a relatively groundbreaking idea, but in his era it was, because people kind of gave it as given that colonialism was somehow helping India. that it was a force for good. And this was, of course, a very popular notion in places like London. So he was one of the first people to, again, kind of stand up and say, no, that's not the case. It's the process is much more complex than that. And Naroji didn't just wage his political activities in India. He lived for a good part of 5 decades in Great Britain. He took the fight for Indian political rights to the heart of empire, lived in London, campaigned for political rights there, stood for parliament, and entered the British parliament as well. So he was someone who was important not just for India, but also for British politics as well, as someone who was recognized as the first Asian parliamentarian, the first person of Asian descent to sit in the House of Commons. This was a cartoon that was made in India in 1892, but reproduced in British publications. And it shows Naroji as kind of this colossus who is standing with one foot in England and one foot in India. And that's really who he was in many ways. He had, his political activities spanned both countries and eventually many more countries as well. So he engaged very closely with political culture in Great Britain. One of the things he really tried to do was tell ordinary Britons, people who had never been out of the country, who really didn't know much anything about what the empire was like, other than, people were getting rich off it, what the real conditions were like in India. And he spent countless hours lecturing or talking or writing letters to ordinary Britons on these topics. And eventually, this work helped pay off by his being elected in 1892 as a member of parliament. He won an election from central Finsbury in London, which is roughly coterminous with the area of Islington. And he served in parliament for 3 short years. He lost in 1895. But in those very short few years in parliament, he really tried to style himself as being, quote unquote, a member for India, someone who would represent Indian views in parliament, since, of course, India had no parliamentary representation, and it certainly had no parliament of its own in India as well. And at times, he could be quite a bold voice in parliament. I mean, this is an etching of one session of parliament from, I think, 1894 or 1895, where parliamentarians are debating issues of British colonial policy in India. And Naroji is saying to fellow parliamentarians, you are an alien people in India. You don't really know how bad things are. By the end of his life, Naroji became associated with the idea of Swaraj. And this is a cartoon that was produced in 1906, just after he told the Indian National Congress that the Congress had to fight for Swaraj or self-rule for India. And you can see that Naroji is portrayed as kind of like a Hindu sadhu, if you will, meditating under the banner of Swaraj. And this is typical of what his popular depiction was like at the time. I mean, we all think of Tilak when we think of Swaraj, but Naroji was another person who was also closely associated with that term and idea. Now, focusing on the topic at hand, Naroji had a decades-long relationship with Bombay, in part because he grew up over here and he died over here. And if you look at the website, my personal website, I've actually created a map that shows you different areas in Bombay that were associated with his life. So afterward, you can go to this website and see the different parts of Bombay that were important in different aspects of his career. Now, before I get to the substance of the talk itself, I want to just for a few minutes talk about how one researches a person like Naroji. Dadabhai Naoroji's papers are, unfortunately, not here in Mumbai, but they're in Delhi. They're kept at the National Archives in India, and they're huge. They're 30,000 documents in size, and they're kept in these massive green boxes in the archives. And what you see over here is one shelf that constitutes maybe about 1/2 to 1/3 of the collection. So, all of these boxes plus another 1 or 2 aisles constitutes the Naroji papers. And inside each of these boxes is a file. And a file could contain a document that could be anything from a short letter to a booklet of 100 pages. And there are about 50 to 60 such documents within each box. And you open up each particular file and you'll find a letter. And as you can see from the state of this letter over here, a lot of the material has been damaged quite badly. And in fact, what we have today in terms of the Naroji collection at the National Archives of India is probably only half of what existed during Naroji's lifetime. Probably about half of his correspondence got lost. Now, by Indian standards, this is actually quite good, given that we've lost so many collections of important people. The fact that half of this collection survives is actually not a bad record. But how precisely do collections decay in India? There are many reasons. One of the reasons is the type of conservation we employ. We still employ in India. A lot of the methodologies for conservation are woefully outdated. People use lamination indiscriminately in Indian archives and research institutions, and lamination is a technology that's not used anymore in the West. It continues to be used here, and over time, it really causes a lot of damage. It becomes difficult to read these letters. Oftentimes, there can be chemical reactions in the paper from the ink that was being used in the 19th century with the paper. It tends to eat through the paper. And by the time one encounters the letter, say 100, 150 years later, the letter is falling apart into pieces. So oftentimes when you read these letters, you're reading them in small snippets because parts have literally fallen out. Another problem is that any letter that was written by a particular individual, back then in that era, you could not have a copy unless you actually put, like, say, a sheet of carbon paper down and kept a physical copy of your outgoing letter. These so-called carbon copies or press copies were incredibly fragile, and again, over time, they became much more difficult to read. So if you read them now, the writing is quite faded. And if you put all these factors together, you get, what is representative of what material is like in the Naroji papers or any other historical collection in India. It's very tough to work with it, because material is missing, the handwriting is blurry and unreadable. Oftentimes, instead of letters, there are holes. I would have to learn how to read holes instead of handwriting. And oftentimes the letters have fallen apart. So it can be a very difficult process, consequently. And here in Bombay, the conditions are not good either. I mean, if you work in the Maharashtra State Archives, the printed material there, this is printed, published material, can be in as bad condition. Sometimes the newspaper collections are literally falling apart, and since you're working in an old archival facility with a fan whirring above you, the newspapers you are reading are disintegrating before your very eyes. So those are the challenges that one faces when you go into an archive and research a figure like Naroji. Now, getting to the topic at hand, Naroji's relationship with the city of Bombay, let's begin with the very beginning of his life. Now, Naroji's family came from the town of Navsari in South Gujarat, close by to Surat. He was part of a priestly Zoroastrian family that had a very long ancestry in the city. This was a family tree that was done in the early 20th century, and you see Naroji there on kind of the bottom left-hand corner. His family could theoretically trace descent all the way back to the first Zoroastrian priest to enter the city of Navsari, several centuries beforehand. They were related to some of the most important and wealthy individuals in both Navsari and Surat. Indeed, two of Naroji's ancestors actually met the Emperor Jahangir in Ahmedabad and were given a bighah of land and a farman by the emperor. So he came from a relatively prosperous and well-off family that was held in very high repute in Zoroastrian priestly circles. But by the time that Naroji was born, and by the time of his parents and his grandparents, his family had fallen on hard times, like most people throughout Gujarat or India. People became much more poor, indigenous industries dried up, and so his grandfather and his father worked as priests and also as agriculturalists in the vicinity of Navsari, in an area called Dharampur, a princely state nearby. So they were, they grew up in and lived their lives in very poor circumstances. This is, just out of, for general interest, this is a horoscope of when Naroji was born. Those of you who know how to read this stuff might find it interesting. I can't really read it. But, getting onto the topic of, where Naroji was born, if you go to the town of Navsari, you will still today see a building called the Naroji birthplace. This is in an area close by to the Mirji Rana Library. And the interesting thing about the Naroji birthplace is that Naroji was actually not born here. It's a common misconception, and everyone from modern day visitors down to Gandhi himself have been misled, unfortunately. This was probably a property that was connected with the Navsari-based Durdi family to which Naroji belonged. It's undoubtedly a very old house. It probably, Naroji himself probably visited it at his point in time, but he wasn't born there. It's in the process of being hopefully preserved, and I hope indeed it does get properly preserved. But we know from Naroji's own writing that he was born in the city of Bombay. And precisely as to precisely where, we'll use a map that was published in 1855 of what was known as the native town of Bombay. Now, this roughly coincides with the area today that we call, say, Bhendi Bazaar, or parts of Buleshwar, or even Kamatipura. So as you can see on the map, I put contemporary landmarks, JJ Hospital and the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj terminus. The native town was between these two landmarks, and the particular area where he was born and grew up was an area called Khadak. Now, this is a small warren of streets close by to today's Masjid Bandar station. You actually see the Masjid Bandar railroad station at the very bottom of this part of the map. And it still exists today. I mean, you can go and see Khadak. It's, of course, has no bearing or resemblance to what it was like in Naroji's childhood. There's absolutely no trace of any house that Naroji lived in, or any house from that era. It's quite a bustling, very, very busy area with markets. But this is where he grew up in. He grew up in the heart of the what was called the native town, surrounded by very cosmopolitan, surroundings, temples, mosques, Jewish synagogues, Parsi fire temples, and further to the north and the south, the houses of wealthy Europeans, Parsis, wealthy Hindus, Muslims, etc. Now, as I mentioned, Naroji came from a priestly family, and since he was the firstborn of a Parsi priest, he was expected to continue in the priestly line. And so he went through the first step of priestly initiation, the Navar ceremony, when he was around 11 years old at Wadia Atashbira in what is today Princess Street. He was one of the first Parsi boys to actually go through the ceremony at this particular Atashbira. Prior to this era, Parsi boys would have been sent back to Navsari to undergo this ceremony. But he never became a practicing priest. And the reason is because when he was about 4 or 5 years old, his father died. And when his father died, the expectation that he would go on to become a professional priest kind of went out the window as well. So instead, what his widowed mother did was enroll him in a school. Now, in this era, the early 1830s, the late 1820s, indigenous schools, pathshalas, if you will, were quite informal affairs. With apologies to Getty Images, this is probably something similar to what Naroji's school looked like when he was, say, around maybe 7, 8, 9 years of age. It would have been students sitting on a street, in a house, maybe in a temple or even a mosque, where the teacher or mehta would go around kind of instructing them on basic principles of, say, arithmetic or writing. And Naroji, from a very young age, distinguished himself as being an extremely bright pupil, especially good at mathematics. One of the popular forms of entertainment in that day was for a very bright pupil to be shown calculating sums at a very rapid pace. And indeed, this is what Naroji's teachers did with Dadabhai Naoroji when he was very young. He'd give him sums to like add, subtract, multiply, divide, and he'd do this at a very fast pace and apparently attract a crowd. I mean, this was, again, popular entertainment in a very different era. Eventually, Naroji's indigenous teacher convinced his mother to enroll Naroji in an innovative experiment called the Bombay Native Education Society. This was an early attempt at public education. Now, in the early 19th century, public education did not really exist, obviously, in India, nor did it really exist much in England as well. So this was quite a revolutionary experiment, not just by Indian standards, but world standards. There was an attempt by the British Indian government under Mountstuart Elphinstone to start up a small system of schools where free education would be imparted to deserving Indians. Again, it was a very limited body of Indian children who were given this privilege, not by wealth, but just by particular happenstance. And Naroji was selected to attend the most prestigious of these schools that was run by British and Indian teachers, where English language education was imparted as well. There was something called the Central English School that existed on what was called the Esplanade at that point in time. And again, here Naroji distinguished himself, but like the indigenous school, there was a great degree of informality in this particular school, even though there were British teachers. And Naroji recalled that as a child, he oftentimes would bunk school with his friends and go out to the Esplanade in order to play gilli danda, the Indian version of cricket, if you will. And Naroji had a very lifelong association with cricket, which again, I can't get into in this talk, but maybe in another talk I can speak about. So, from a very early age, he was doing stuff like sports as well. So his education was not entirely in the classroom, so to speak. Another aspect of his childhood was marriage. In this era, Parsis, as well as pretty much all other Indian communities, used the institution of child marriage. And at the age of 7, Naroji was married off to the daughter of a Parsi acquaintance, a girl called Gulbai Shroff, when Naroji was around 11 years of age and his to-be wife was 7. Their marriage lasted for a good 70 years, but we know hardly anything about the woman he married. Apparently, it wasn't a terribly happy marriage. His wife was illiterate and refused really to be educated. We don't really know much about her, unfortunately. And it's amazing that this image even survives, because it's been really hard for me to track any written source about her in the archives. But this was another aspect of Naroji's childhood, marriage. Again, it shows you how much stuff has changed and how different even, say, a community like the Parsis, who were thought to be progressive, were in fact, not too long ago, 150 plus years ago. So Naroji, as I said, did very well in school at this Central English School in Bombay, and consequently he was selected to attend what was really the premier institution of higher education in Western India at the time, Elphinstone College. So in 1840, when he was about 15 years old, he was enrolled in Elphinstone College. But of course, Elphinstone in that era was not the Elphinstone that we today know of in Kalagoda. It was located elsewhere. It was located roughly coterminous with where St. Xavier's High School is today in the Dobi Talao area. So the college premises were here, and it was here that Naroji received a college education. And again, by all accounts, he was quite a brilliant student. And his brilliance was probably reflective of the fact that he had some very good teachers, not just British teachers. I mean, he had some very eminent Scottish and English and Irish teachers, but he also had Indian professors as well. One of the unique aspects of Elphinstone was that, unlike educational institutions in places like Calcutta, it actually did a somewhat decent job of promoting Indian talent. So 2 of the professors who worked there were Indians. One was Bal Gangadhar Shastri Jambekar, a brilliant polymath who unfortunately died when he was only around 33 years of age. The picture that you see here is probably only just an artist's conception of him, since he died at such a young age. And the other teacher he had was Naroji Fardunji, who was himself a very important political figure. And these individuals, plus many others, taught Naroji subjects like political economy, history, algebra, calculus, physics. And we have some records of what Naroji's college educational achievements were like, because his performance was recorded in early educational reports. So we know that he was singled out as being one of the best students in these particular classes that he took on, say, optics or political economy. You can see in this write-up also that particularly bad students were also talked about. So the last line says, Gulam Sahib Chorge has done nothing. Unfortunately, were quite unvarnished views of the bad students as well. But he was regarded by one of his professors as being, quote unquote, the promise of India. So from a very young age, I mean, when he was about 16, 17 years of age, his teachers had already singled him out for relatively big and ambitious things. So, he left Elphinstone when, he was around maybe 17 or 18 years of age as quite a distinguished student and as someone who people were really looking out for to be a future leader. And thus we come to Naroji's early career, what his career unfolded like when he was in his very early 20s. We have two images of Dadabhai Naoroji when he was 20. And they look quite different, which is unusual. So here's the first image. And as you can see, I've put on the slide the question, in this era, roughly 1848, 1847, if you as an Indian have a college education, what precisely do you do with it? There's not much you could really do with it at this point in time. Because if you wanted to be wealthy, you could join an Indian mercantile firm, but that did not necessarily require a college education. In fact, a college education might not actually steed you well for such an occupation. You might instead need the mathematical skills that you would have gained from an indigenous school, rather than, say, learning about Latin and Greek and all the other topics you would learn about in Elphinstone. You could go into government service, but government service was, oftentimes a dead end. You could only go so far as a clerk or as a government servant. So the answer to the question, paired with the other image of Dadabhai Naoroji when he was 20, was he went back to school. He went back to Elphinstone College and became a teacher. And this is the enrollment form. You can see Naroji's name at the very top of a group of people that were known as native assistants. These were Indians who graduated from places like Elphinstone, whose jobs were basically to act as tutors, to kind of be intermediaries between students at Elphinstone and the professors. So if you had a professor who was Irish or English, who was teaching chemistry to Indian students, you as the native assistant or the native master, like Dadabhai Naoroji, would help the students or translate the lectures into Gujarati or Marathi. And this is the first job that Naroji held. He rose through the ranks quite quickly. So he went from being a native master to being an acting professor with relatively quick speed, again, which is testament to the fact that in Elphinstone, native talent was oftentimes rewarded. It was oftentimes rewarded with promotion. And we have some samples of the type of exams that Naroji gave his students, again, printed in government reports. So if you want to, try out your hand at the mathematical problems that Naroji gave his students, you can. Those exam papers are there. Now, while Naroji was teaching, he also got involved in some of the extracurricular activities and student life of Elphinstone as well. In the year 1848, he founded something called the Students' Literary and Scientific Society, which was meant to kind of broaden education beyond this group of students that were receiving schooling at Elphinstone College to the wider public. It was meant to hold public lectures for people who are conversant in English or Gujarati or Marathi on topics of practical knowledge. And as you can see from this listing of the founding members, Naroji was number 2 in this organization. He was right after one of the individuals who was a professor at Elphinstone, a Scotsman called Richard Reed. And he really helped steer this organization through its first few years. So what did this organization do precisely? It, as I said, promoted some public talks. So Naroji gave talks on various aspects of scientific or practical knowledge. So we know, for example, that he gave a talk on how a steam engine worked. At the same time, he would take his own students into dockyards at Mazgaon or even the Boribandar railway station, what's now CST, to show students how a locomotive worked or how a steamship worked. So that was one aspect, kind of disseminating practical knowledge amongst both students and the general public. But the other very unique aspect of this organization was promoting education beyond, say, a group of students at Elphinstone or the general public, which was invariably men, to the other 50% of humanity, women. Now, in this era, 1840s, 1850s, India was very behind in one department in terms of education. I mean, if you compare education of men in India and men in, say, the United Kingdom, there is a difference, but it's not as substantial as we think it is. I mean, the rates of education in India were not necessarily as bad, but amongst women, they definitely were. Female education in India definitely lagged quite far behind. It was starting to make some leaps and bounds in places like Calcutta or Bombay through missionary activity and through the work of the government. But this organization was one of the first organizations to really take indigenous Indian talent and channel it towards educating Indian girls. It was quite a revolutionary concept at this point in time because Indian men at this point in time were extremely orthodox. Naroji recalled when he was, in his early 20s, he would try to go from door to door in Bombay to convince fathers to send their daughters to school. And oftentimes the fathers would greet him either with curse words or by slamming the door in his face. So it was not an easy proposition to convince fathers to let their daughters be allowed to attend schools. But people like Naroji persisted. And with time, their efforts paid off quite handsomely. And this reveals another important aspect of Naroji's political philosophy that influenced his political career and also his interactions with the city of Bombay. Naroji believed very strongly in gender equality. This is a quote from a little bit later in his life, but you can see from this quote that he's really talking about gender equality in quite a strikingly modern fashion. Not only did he promote female education in places like Bombay, but he also promoted female education across India and also women's suffrage in Great Britain. I don't know too much about what his views were like about women's suffrage in India. I mean, that was quite a novel topic to be discussed in India at this point in time, but certainly in Great Britain, he did a lot to promote the right of women to have the right to vote. And he joined several feminist organizations in Great Britain at the time. So Naroji was very progressive for his era in terms of gender dynamics, in terms of social reform. And he was one of the people who was teaching in these very early schools. Originally, there was a small network of schools that the Students' Literary and Scientific Society set up. One component was imparting education in Marathi, and the other component was imparting education in Gujarati to Parsi students, and eventually a third branch is put in for imparting students to Gujaratis, Hindu Gujaratis as well, and eventually Muslims as well. But this is the very beginnings of indigenous female education. And it really gathered pace quite quickly. So in the very first years, it was not a very successful venture, but by 1855, it had become wildly successful. There were hundreds of students enrolled in these schools, and slowly but surely, some of these students were themselves becoming teachers. So you have, for the first time, women Indian teachers teaching female student bodies, which again was quite revolutionary for this point in time. Now, this effort was led by students at Elphinstone College, but these students couldn't do it alone. They did it with the help of individuals who are known as Shetiyas, individuals who are wealthy Indian traders, who presided over some of the biggest Indian companies or merchant houses at this point in time. And one fascinating aspect of this era is this kind of spirit of cooperation that you had between the mercantile elite, or at least some of the mercantile elite, and this new body of educated Indian men. The mercantile elite gave the money to these educated Indian men, and the educated men set up these schools. So one of the most prominent supporters of female education at this point in time was this man, K.N. Kama. Another important supporter was Jagannath Shankar Sheth, who actually set up a girls' school at his house site in Nana Chowk. Another thing that Naroji set up in order to start a program of social and religious reform in Bombay as well as within his Parsi community was the newspaper Rast Guftar. He was one of its first editors. He was one of the founders of this paper. And this disseminated three messages, basically: social reform, religious reform, mostly for the Parsis, though eventually once Hindu Gujaratis got involved in this paper, also Hindu religion was discussed as well, and lastly, political reform. So this was quite again, a path-breaking paper at this time, and it could also have been the highest circulating paper in India by the late 1850s or 1860s. This is a claim that some scholars have made, including people like Jim Masalas. It was run by a group of individuals, mostly Parsis, though eventually people like Karsundas Mulji join also and lend a more cosmopolitan flair. And Naroji writes a lot in this paper, but also stewards kind of the political line that is taken by this particular newspaper. Now, all of these aspects that I've talked about were part of a movement that was called Young Bombay. There was, in this era, something called Young Bengal, which again alluded to kind of this new group of educated Indians who were experimenting with new ideas, embracing Western education, talking about social and religious reform. And that term Young Bombay or Young Bengal comes back from the terminology that was employed in Europe. There was a Young Italy, for example, led by people like Giuseppe Mazzini. And the whole idea of kind of like reform, imbuing nationalist ideas, kind of, putting together an idea of what society and the nation should be like. People like Naroji helped do that job in India, the same job that was done in places like Europe by people like Mazzini and such. So this was an important movement in terms of Bombay's intellectual development. And it really reflected in many ways how Naroji was remembered during his life. So whereas, Naroji was known mostly throughout India as an important political leader, amongst his fellow Gujarati speakers, he was oftentimes still recognized for his social reform or educational activities, which is reflective in this particular image that you see here. You see in the English text, he's talked about as being the grand old man of India. But for those of you who can read Gujarati, he's being referred to specifically as being a social reformer and an educator of women. So it shows you how he was thought of in different ways by different communities. So in the year 1855, Naroji left for the first time the city of Bombay and sailed to Great Britain. This is a picture of Apollo Bandar, which was a part of Bombay that Naroji became very familiar with because he came and left Bombay numerous times from here. In the year 1855, he joined a group of Parsis, including members of the Kama family, to set up what was reputed to be the first British company set up entirely by Indians in Great Britain itself. This was a cotton import and export company called Kama and Company that had offices in Liverpool and London. And when Naroji and his group of fellow merchants left in order to set up this organization and left Bombay to go to England, it was so significant that it actually made the newspapers. I mean, it was actually discussed in learned societies in this era, as you can see from this newspaper clipping. Naroji and his peers who left actually caused a huge traffic jam in Colaba that day because hundreds of people turned up in order to see them off as their boat departed. So this was a big deal. Now, as I mentioned, the company that Naroji worked for dealt with the cotton trade, which was kind of one of the two big engines upon which Bombay's economy was built upon in this era, the other engine, of course, being opium. And eventually, by the year 1859, Naroji actually sets up his own business in Bombay, in London, called Dadabhai Naoroji and Company, which survives until 1881, which dealt exclusively in cotton, both importing cotton from India and also exporting cotton machinery, cotton ginning machinery to India as well. So, some of the first cotton machinery that is given to the earliest mills in India was sent out by Dadabhai Naoroji's company to places like Ahmedabad and as well as to mills in Bombay as well. While Dadabhai Naoroji was in London, he kept up very strong connections with Bombay. So again, on my website, I've created a map of different sites that were associated with Naroji's life in London. And a lot of these sites were important in overseas Bombay networks. One of Naroji's houses in Bombay was called Parsi Lodge, to kind of indicate, his ties with his community, and visiting Parsis from Bombay and elsewhere would stay there. We know of at least one house in I think, Marylebone called Bombay Lodge. A lot of houses or boarding houses that cater to Indian students would be called, say, Bombay House or Calcutta House or what have you. The house of W.C. Banerjee, the first president of the Congress, was called Kidderpur House, and it was located in Croydon. And Kidderpur was the neighborhood where W.C. Banerjee came from in Calcutta. So if you go to London today, you can see many of these houses still, where Naroji lived in and where visitors from Bombay stayed as well. So in Notting Hill, for example, this house was where Naroji lived along with Naroji Fardunji, who came to Great Britain in the 1870s. This house still exists. It's slightly modified. If you go meanwhile to southwest London, to an area called Penge, close by to the Crystal Palace, This particular house was where Dadabhai Naoroji lived in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And we had tried with English Heritage to put up a blue plaque here just a few years ago, and unfortunately it didn't work out, but we're still trying. There might be a blue plaque for London sometime in the near future. So even though Naroji was outside of Bombay, there were Bombay networks that he was very closely tied into. So this house that you're looking at right now, people like Dinsha Vacha or Gopal Krishna Gokhale would have visited him here. His grandchildren would have stayed here, on visits from Bombay. So Bombay networks were inputted here as well. And while in England, Naroji also mentored a number of people from Bombay or Gujarat or Maharashtra who came to study. So one individual was Firoz Shah Mehta. Naroji took him under his wing and involved Firoz Shah Mehta in organizations he helped form to promote Indian political activism in London. Another individual was Joseph Baptista, who came from an East Indian background. There's a garden in Masgaon that's named after him. He eventually became an associate of Tilak. Naroji helped him with campaigning for his first election to the BMC in the early 1900s. Joseph Baptista went to Cambridge, and so whenever Baptista came down to London, he would meet with Naroji, and then they would talk about politics. And of course, the other famous individual who was associated with Naroji in this era was, of course, Mahatma Gandhi. We don't know precisely when Gandhi first met Naroji, whether it was when Gandhi was as a student in London in the early 1890s or during subsequent visits back to London in the late 1890s and early 1900s. But the two definitely did meet one another. Gandhi went to one of Naroji's offices also in southwest London, and they kept up a very long correspondence throughout the remainder of Naroji's life. Now, Naroji's stay in London, which went on for decades from 1855 till his retirement in 1907, was interspersed by several trips back to Bombay. And while Naroji was in London, for the most part, his family, his mother, his wife, and his children, he eventually had one son and two daughters, stayed in Bombay. And they lived in a house in Ketwadi. And one of the more unusual finds from the archive that I found was the floor plans of his house. Large, huge document. And this is a scan of it that you see over here. Naroji's house in Ketwadi was located somewhere between 5th and 6th Ketwadi Lane. You can still go to this area today. And it's quite likely that his house was acquired and demolished and eventually paved over in order to build what is today SVP Road, Sandhurst Road. So when you drive down or walk down SVP Road between 5th and 6th Ketwadi Lane, chances are you are probably going over Dadabhai Naoroji's house. That was where his family stayed until at least the 1890s. That's where, again, his mother probably passed away, where his wife lived, and where his children grew up, and some of his grandchildren grew up as well. One long period of return for Dadabhai Naoroji to India took place in the 1870s, when Naroji became the Diwan or Prime Minister of Baroda to Mallarao Gaikwad, who was unfortunately a rather ill-fated Gaikwad of Baroda. He was eventually taken out of office by British authorities after he made the somewhat ill-fated decision to try to poison the British resident. They didn't get along, to say the least. But while Naroji was in Baroda, he brought in these Bombay links again. He imported a lot of the best minds of Bombay, or tried to import the best minds of Bombay to work with him in Baroda. So he tried to get a very bright young individual from Elphinstone and Bombay University, a man called M.G. Ranade, to work with him in Baroda. And unfortunately, Ranade could not do that because he was just beginning his judicial career. He had another one of his former students, a man called Bal Mangesh Wagle, who eventually became, I think, the Minister for Justice. So a lot of very well-educated Bombay individuals worked with Bombay in his political activities, not just in London, but in places like Baroda, where he was involved as Prime Minister. But Naroji eventually came back to Bombay after his stint in Baroda and joined Bombay politics for a short while. He joined the BMC and the town council. And while working on the BMC, he made a name for himself. He was one of the earliest voices, along with people like Naroji Fardunji, to really campaign for the BMC working in the favor of those Indians that it was supposed to work in favor, not just British people or not just wealthy Indians, but relatively average Bombay citizens. So one of the topics that he really kind of spent a lot of time campaigning on behalf were loans that were taken out in order to build the lakes at Vihar and Tansa for the Bombay waterworks, the water supply, the source of our drinking water today, the water that we're still drinking today. The loans that were taken out for these dams were probably taken at a very high rate of interest, unnaturally high rate of interest. And Naroji strongly protested this and said, you're basically ripping off the taxpayers of Bombay. And so he really made this one of his topics of passion. And he went into great detail to show how taxpayers of Bombay were being ripped off. And the BMC eventually kind of commended him for his work to show how the situation was not to the advantage of the citizens of Bombay. While back in Bombay, Naroji also broadened his base with a new crop of political leaders that were emerging in the city, people like Dinshawacha, again, people like Ranade, eventually people like Gokhale. And one of Naroji's closest political allies was a man called Bairamji Malbari. Now, we think of Bairamji Malbari as an important social reformer, the person who was, who was the main force behind the Age of Consent Act. But Malbari was also a very important political figure as well. He was known as the right-hand man of Dadabhai Naoroji in his age. And the two men cooperated on a whole variety of things, setting up nationalist newspapers, establishing the Congress, and eventually fomenting the networks that would help Dadabhai Naoroji run for parliament in Great Britain. So while Dadabhai Naoroji was standing for parliament in the 1880s and early 1890s, Bairamji Malbari would be at his office in Hornby Road in Fort, talking to various important Indians and saying, can you support Naroji? Can you bring funds to his campaigns? Can you tell your friends to contribute to his finances? Can you tell their English friends to support him in Great Britain? And so without Bairamji Malbari's help in Bombay, some 10,000 kilometers away, it's very unlikely that Naroji's parliamentary career would have existed at all. He really kind of held down the fort in India to make sure that people supported both morally, financially, and in terms of physical work to his campaign. And they had an extremely broad and vast correspondence. There are nearly 1,000 letters that survived between them, and they knew each other on very familiar terms. Naroji was referred to by Bairamji Malbari as Dad. So the first time I encountered these letters, I was wondering, is this a letter from his son? But no, it's just an abbreviation for Dadabhai. Sometimes Malbari would, his anger would show in the papers, his emotions would show, and sometimes Naroji would complain, your handwriting is too sloppy and, you need to improve your handwriting. So, we know from this that they were on very familiar terms. And they worked together on a whole bunch of different political projects. Now, in the late 1880s, Indians were trying to get any sort of political representation they could get their hands on. It was very difficult, right? I mean, there was no parliament. The legislative councils that existed at this point in time in, say, Bombay presidency or Bengal presidency were largely political rubber stamps. There was no scope for any Indian to speak his mind. So they came up with all sorts of wild proposals to find out ways for India to get representation. And one kind of wild, crazy way was to suggest that Bombay was actually really a part of England. And they did this by actually going back to the deed, which kind of gave Bombay over to Charles II. And in this particular deed from the 1600s, it claimed that Bombay and the islands of Bombay at this point in time was technically part of the Royal Manor of East Greenwich, which was a legal formulation that was used for all sorts of different things. It was used for the Virginia Company in North America. It was used for different new colonies that were set up in the New World. It didn't really mean much. But people like Naroji and Malbari kind of tried to use it to argue that actually technically Bombay is a part of Great Britain and therefore it deserves parliamentary representation. This idea did not really go that far, as you can imagine, but it did have its different uses. In the 1890s, some Britons took Naroji to court to claim that as an Indian subject, he had no right to vote in Great Britain, nor stand for parliament. And his lawyer actually came up with the argument that no, actually, as a citizen of Bombay, Bombay is technically a part of Greenwich, and Greenwich is a part of England, and so therefore Bombay being a part of England means that Naroji was a British subject. And that logic was bought by the court in question. So it did actually work in some aspects. I'm almost done, so I'll get through the rest of the presentation in the next few minutes. So Naroji and his political supporters in Bombay worked in a variety of innovative ways in order to kind of take political clout in Bombay and elsewhere throughout India and channel it in the direction of London and the political activities that Naroji was heading up. And after Dadabhai Naoroji won election in 1892 to Parliament, very prominent citizens actually sent a picture book of Bombay to what were called the electors of Central Finsbury, the people who voted for him in London. And you can still see this picture book if you go to a museum in Islington. It was a picture book that was meant to show off Bombay as a very modern city, but was also meant to show off that Bombay really had built up a robust political tradition. So the people who signed this picture book in this particular image you can see included Firozshah Mehta, N.G. Chandavarkar, Dinsha Manakji Petit, others like D.E. Vacha, and there were pictures from the Indian National Congress session of the previous year. So it was kind of meant to show that, you know, we Indians or we people of Bombay are probably more advanced than we would like to believe. The first time that Dadabhai Naoroji came back to Bombay after he won his election for Parliament was in December 1893. And he came back to Bombay in order to go on to Lahore in order to preside at the Indian National Congress session held in December of that year. And when he came back to Bombay, about 500,000 people came out to greet him, which in that era, even in that area, was a huge amount of people. It was about half the number of people in the city, because Bombay only had about 1 million people in this era. This was a vast and largely spontaneous demonstration that started at Apollo Bandar and ended only at his house in Ketwadi, at the house which I showed, you know, kind of an image of where that the site is today on SVP Road. And it involved stops at Hindu temples, it involved stops at Parsi temples, schools, various sites of public importance. It was, you know, kind of, you know, political theater at its best, if you will. So it was a big political moment. And something similar happened in 1906 when Naroji came back to preside at the 1906 Congress, the last Congress, if you will, where Naroji was politically active. And at this Congress, Naroji declared that self-government or Swaraj was the goal of the Congress. And as you can see in this cartoon, the man who's accompanying Naroji on the gangplank to the ship is holding a flag that says self-government or Swaraj in Gujarati script. So let me conclude with Naroji's retirement. Naroji retired in the year 1907. He left England in quite ill health, and he came back to live in a house in Versova. One of the so-called Sat Bangla, or the 7 bungalows in Versova, one of the original Sat Bangla was Naroji's bungalow, a bungalow called the Sands. We don't know where precisely it was. And if any of you have any ideas, please do tell me, because I tried many years ago going to Versova, asking people, and no one, of course, had any clue. But it definitely was by the sea at this point in that time. It was called the Sands, and Naroji lived out his last quiet few years in this house. And here's an image of Naroji in the center of the picture with some of his family members. And the one interesting thing that you can tell from this very grainy picture is that there also was a dog. So we know that there was a family dog in this household as well, which of course strikes us as being quite Parsi. Now, even though Naroji was retired, and even though he was in his late 80s and early 90s, he still remained to a small degree politically active. Every birthday, he would issue a message to the Indian people, giving them kind of like a message of hope and telling them, you know, don't resort to violence, resort to constitutional methods for political activities. And he continued to meet with various politicians. So here is Naroji at the age of 90 meeting with Annie Besant. And Annie Besant got him to be the first president of a home rule society, which really annoyed certain people like Firozshah Mehta and Dinsha Vacha because they thought Annie Besant was too radical. But Naroji thought it was the right thing to do. One of the first people that Gandhi met when he came back to came back to India in 1915 from Great Britain and South Africa was Naroji. On the same day that Gandhi meets Jinnah at the Pittit's house, at the Pittit's garden party. Just before that, he met with Naroji when he was, again, Naroji was around 90 years old. The last public event which Naroji participated in took place in January 1916, when he was honored with an honorary doctorate at the Convocation Hall at Bombay University. And after this convocation took place, Naroji was taken on one last procession through the city. And very appropriately enough, this procession, this public procession and parade, stopped at various girls' schools. And at the girls' schools, female teachers and girl students would sing songs to him or present garlands of flowers. So at the very end of his political career, you have kind of a hearkening back to the first real big activity that Naroji does in Bombay, female education. And it kind of provides a bit of symmetry for his life in Bombay. So let me just finally end. We do have a statue of Naroji today. Mostly it's us Parsis who know about it or who celebrate it. But Naroji really deserves to be known much more than he is today. He obviously was not just a Parsi figure. He wasn't viewed as a Parsi figure in his era, and he certainly doesn't deserve to be just a Parsi figure today. He was a figure of far greater importance to all Indians. One thing I'm really trying to achieve through my book is to show how Naroji was important, not just for the cause of Indian nationalism, but also for something much broader, politics in Great Britain, as well as global anti-colonial politics. Naroji was in touch with people in America who were anti-colonialists, European socialists, colonial subjects in places like South America or South Africa, even Cyprus. He was far more ahead of his times than many other Indian nationalists at this point in time. He understood that Indian nationalism really needed to be a global campaign in order for it to have any chances of success. So with that, I'll end, and we can perhaps go to questions.
Thank you, Dinyar. That was amazing. Comments are already flowing in about these nuggets, how important they were. You would have seen some of them have come as private messages. Let me begin by asking you, as a person of color, what would Naroji have made of this campaign of Black Lives Matter and the way it's gathered steam in England?
Yeah, so I'll actually be writing an article about this for a magazine shortly, so I can even forward on my views. He, again, quite unlike other Indian politicians in this era, he took a very strong interest in members of the African diaspora, whether they were African Americans or Africans living in Britain. So he would have entirely sympathized with the cause. He helped with what was an event that took place in 1900 called the Pan-African Congress, which was kind of the first effort to bring together Black leaders from around the world, Africans from Africa, African Americans, West Indians, Africans living in Britain for a political conference. We know that there were African Britons, which he was politically associated with. He helped two of them with local campaigns for London City Council elections. And he was, recognized by the African American press as well. One of the people who reads his last speech to the Congress in 1906, where he talks about Swaraj, was W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous African American leader and American socialist.
Okay. You mentioned his interest with cricket, his interest in cricket. Any stories of connecting him to the cricket scene in Bombay, and also, if I may, the dramatic scene in Bombay?
Yeah, there is little bits here and there. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the sources have been lost, so it's hard to piece together, what the record precisely was. In terms of nataks, he was involved in the first kind of Parsi natak mandli, if you will, that was established in, I think, 1849 or 1850. So he was a part of kind of the beginning of what we now know of as Parsi theater. The first dramatic performance that was put on was a rendition of Rustam and Sorab. With regard to cricket, Naroji was definitely very interested in what was going on in cricket in Bombay. He, for those of you who've read Prashant Kidambi's book on cricket country, he is mentioned, Naroji is mentioned. He was involved in some of the cricket life in Bombay, but he was also involved in Indian cricket life in London. There was an Indian cricket club in London. And in his 60s and 70s, Naroji served as honorary president or vice president of various cricket clubs, not just for Indians, but also for Britons. So I would come across letters from cricket organizations in North London where Naroji would be asked to be a patron or a vice president or a president. And I'd kind of wondered myself, here's a man who's 70 years old. He clearly is not playing cricket anymore. Yet his name was associated enough with these organizations that ordinary Englishmen were asking him to serve in some sort of capacity of these organizations.
Okay, so let me club the next two questions. Somebody wants to know if there are any living descendants of Dadabhai Naoroji, and yet another person wants to know who was Kush Naroji, Kush. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, so Dadabhai Naoroji had 3 children, and through his son, his first child, he had 8 grandchildren through just that one particular grandson. I'm not as sure about the other 2 daughters. I think one daughter had 2 children and the other daughter might have been childless, but he had 8 grandchildren. Now, quite incredibly, and this kind of shows another change in Parsi dynamics, none of these 8 grandchildren had any children. So we have kind of the Parsi propensity not to marry or not having children come to fore in his grandchildren's generation. So there are no living descendants, as far as I know. The last of Naroji's grandchildren through his son died in 1980 in Kutch. And with that, the family line stops. If you encounter any Parsi whose last name is Dordi, they are distantly related to Naroji. Naroji was a member of what was called the Dordi clan of Navsari, but there's no direct relationship. Kish Naroji, not Kush, Kish Naroji or Kershasp or KAD was a Tata executive who I think died in the 1970s and who also distinguished himself for bravery for fighting in the Western Front in World War I. His story, like many of his other grandchildren, deserves to be told. It's a very interesting story. I mean, amongst Naroji's various grandchildren, we had 2 women who joined radical politics in France and Great Britain, 1 granddaughter who goes on to lead nonviolent campaigning in the Northwest Frontier Province, 2 Tata executives, female doctors. So it's a pretty uniquely qualified and skilled family, but they had no descendants.
Did they have any connection with Bandra? Where was the Bandra house?
Yeah, so I've heard from various sources that some of them lived in a house in Andheri. I would not know where.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were saying?
Were you saying something? I mean, I know Bairamji. Yeah. Bairamji Malbari had a house in Pali Hill, but direct family relations, I'm not sure if there was a tie with Bandra.
There was a question about his involvement with the Bombay Association. So could you elaborate on that, and also his involvement with his contemporaries like Sir J.J. and Jagannath Sankarseth?
Sure. So the Bombay Association was established in the early 1850s as the first Indian political organization in Bombay. And it was established coterminously with similar organizations in Calcutta and Madras in order to kind of take the first early ferment of Indian political activism and channel it into political activity. And Naroji was one of the Bombay Association. There were 2 factions, if you will. There was the Shettiya faction, which was kind of this old commercial elite, so people like JJ or Jagannath Sankarseth, and there was the young Bombay faction, educated young students like Naroji or Naroji Fardunji, or other individuals, Maharashtrians, Gujaratis, Muslims, what have you, who joined this organization. And people like Naroji, again, we have no direct evidence for his participation in kind of the reformist bent of the organization, but it's quite likely that he was a part of it. They pushed for active promotion of the idea that the British should have responsibility for improving educational opportunities for Indians, should allow some sort of representative element in city government and municipal government and even local provincial government. So he definitely played a role. Some members of the Shettiya class did not like this. They thought that they were being too progressive. and eventually certain people backed away. But Naroji seemed to have pretty good relations with most of the Shettiar class. I mean, he certainly got along well with JJ, Jagannath Shankar Sheth. I believe also with the Sassoons he got along quite well with.
Okay, Naushad Agrawala had a question. Just like we had Gandhiji, and his turning point was the railway incident being thrown out. Was there any turning point in Dadabhai Naoroji's life which made him turn to politics?
He wrote an autobiographical essay when he was in his 70s, in the 1890s, which is, a pretty interesting document to read. And he claimed that his turning point actually came pretty early in life. It was when he was enrolled in this first experiment in public education, when he was, probably maybe 7, 8, 9 years of age. And he said, he probably reflected on this a little bit later, but he said in this autobiographical statement, the fact that, he had been educated by the public at the expense of poor taxpayers meant that he was honor bound or responsible to kind of return the favor. And for him, that meant going into public service, to join politics. So if we do have some sort of, I mean, there were several turning points in Naroji's career, but this was probably the most significant and long-lasting.
Mm-hmm. Bharat wanted to know, was he ever a successful businessman?
The verdict is out. It seems, again, when he joined the Kama business in the 1850s, both he and another partner, K.R. Kama, both seemed to be very easily distracted from business concerns. They both got very easily and quickly involved in academic associations in Great Britain and even in France. And after a while, K.R. Kama quits the organization and goes to study Zoroastrianism in France and Germany. And Naroji goes on to found his own organization. If we are to believe certain stories, Naroji was too honest for some business practices. This account comes out in Masani's biography of Naroji. There's a story where Naroji refuses to kind of use a particular business practice that kind of was meant to cheat the customer. Whether this is true or not, it's hard to say. It's really hard to confirm. But certainly his business was successful enough for him to become quite wealthy by the 1870s, 1880s. Like all businessmen in Bombay, he suffered tremendously during the share mania, after the share mania in the 1860s. He went bankrupt in 1865, 1866, while in London. So getting bankrupt in Bombay is hard enough, right? But when you're bankrupt in London, where the prices are so much more exponentially expensive, and when Naroji had just made the mistake of bringing his entire family to London, was infinitely more difficult. So, how precisely he dug himself out of that financial hole, I'm not precisely sure. I know he was still in debt to certain people by the 1870s, but since the correspondence is lost, I can't really piece together the picture too well.
Okay, talking about surnames, Andrea wants to know why his surname is spelled differently.
I think one question that Farokh basically was posing was that why was his surname spelled differently in different scenarios? So
this is one fun aspect of working with documents from 150 years ago. There was never any one standard way to write someone's name. Every particular person would have like 4 or 5 different ways of transliterating. There was no standard method of transliterating from, say, Gujarati or Marathi or Hindi or Urdu into English. So, it's not just Naroji, it's everyone. And sometimes, Naroji would be referred to as Dadabhai Naoroji Dordi. Sometimes he'd be just referred to as Mr. Dadabhai. Sometimes he'd be referred to as Dadabhai Naoroji. Sometimes Dadabhai Naoroji. It has a lot to do with the quirks of spelling in this era. Unlike the case with some other languages, like say French or Russian or Chinese, there's been no one standard method for transliterating into English. And this makes things much more complex to the historian. Oftentimes we do not know who we're dealing with in a document because the same person might be written by different ways.
Okay, I think Farokh is back. Farokh, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, a question which comes up often from one particular individual who's just been speaking. Where was Dadabhai Naoroji's school? In the port.
We don't know. I know you've asked me that question. also. I mean, the school that he taught was called Baharkot. So therefore, it's outside the fort, right? Outside the fort walls. Where precisely it was, that's a good question. If we had a proper map from the 1850s of fort, we have one, I think, from 1844, but we don't have one from the early 1850s, we might have a better idea. But we just really do not know. Again, unlike, say, Bombay, we do not have the luxury of knowing precisely where everything was. I mean, when I talk to colleagues in Bombay who are trying to trace residences of someone, say, like Naroji or anyone else, they show me this much documentation that shows precisely where something happens. For example, I was just talking with some people in London about where Alan Octavian Hume's house was in London, the founder of the Congress, and voluminous documentation, and we know precisely where it is. We don't know where Naroji's house was precisely in Versova, and we probably will never know.
So there was also a Marathi school which is portrayed on the statue at DN Road. Where would that have been?
Again, we do not know.
Okay.
That's interesting. I didn't realize it was a Marathi school specifically.
Okay.
But the original network of schools that was set up in 1848, half of them were Parsi and half of them were Marathi.
Okay.
So again, as to the precise location, I do not know, unfortunately.
Okay. Kaivan wanted to know about his connection with Navsari Chambers. There are some references about him working out of Navsari Chambers on DN Road. What was his connection with that building?
Well, that was a very important building for anyone really in that era. I mean, the Tatas had an office there. I was just talking with someone else recently who pointed out that another Parsi who was quite prominent in his era but is completely forgotten today, a man called Pestanji Padsha, who was one of the first, obviously, but one of the first individuals to really go up to Gandhi and say, what are you doing in South Africa? Come back to India and work on behalf of India's freedom. He also lived in Navsari Chambers. He lived and died in Navsari Chambers. I can tell you that Naroji probably went to Navsari Chambers, but I do not know whether he had an office there. I would not be able to tell you. Given that he spent so little time in Bombay in the 1880s and 1890s, he probably didn't have an office in the city. He probably just worked out of his house.
Okay. Any other connections of Dadabhai Naoroji with DN Road as we know it now?
Well, I mean, the statue comes up, I think, around 1920. I'm not precisely sure when the road is named. I think 1930s, 1940s at least. So I'm not sure if there's any specific association which people had in mind for renaming. I think the fact that that road in particular was renamed was because in that era, Naroji was still recognized as one of the most prominent individuals, not just from Bombay, but India-wide. So, it was quite logical that, the major roads that were renamed at the very beginning of the whole process of renaming were after Naroji, Firozshah Mehta, and Gandhi, of course, right? Those were three of the individuals you definitely would rename, as well as, Gokhale, and Gokhale's road and Tilak's road were further away from Fort. But the reason why Hornby Road in particular is renamed after him probably just comes down to his importance and the fact that an important road was assigned to him. I hope to be proven wrong.
And of course, his last drive through the city was on Hornby Road.
Right.
Did you have any connections with Parsi theatre? You mentioned it in passing.
Well, aside from that connection with the Parsi Natak Mandali, there's not much. I mean, there is a connection actually with, so there was something called the Gayan Utejak Mandali, the Society for the Promotion of Singing. And he apparently was a very prominent member of this. And there actually are letters that I found, telling Naroji, your subscription is out of date, you need to renew. And of course, he'd send in his notice because he was quite interested in music. The family connection with music seems to have been quite long-lived. His grandchildren sang. One of his granddaughters was a classical singer who was trained in Paris. And Perrin Naoroji, who joined radical politics in Paris, apparently sang Indian patriotic numbers at meetings with people like Savarkar and Bhikaji Cama and others.
Wow. So quite cosmopolitan. The last question is from somebody called Bisni. I'm not sure of the first name because it's not mentioned. Why do people say that he was born in Navsari when he wasn't really?
There was one of his relatives who I think popularized this notion in the early 1900s that Naroji was born there. I'm I'm forgetting I think his name was Jahangir Dordi. I think he was a doctor also. But I mean, it probably was just by pure accident. I mean, I don't think it was meant to be a purposeful misrepresentation. But the house that I showed you a picture of, no doubt had some sort of family connection. Again, we don't know precisely what it was, but I would not doubt that connection, because we know as early or late as the 1920s, as I said, Gandhi was specifically taken to this house and said, this is where Naroji was born. So, I mean, Naroji undoubtedly did have a Navsari connection. He wasn't born there, but, I don't mean to downplay his connection with the town by saying that.
Okay, one of our regular Gauri Nagji wants to know where she can buy a book.
So it's obviously become a bit more complex given the times we're living in. I believe Amazon.in, you can now buy the book there. It's available for pre-order. The book will not be published until the 1st of July. It's been delayed in India. Abroad, it's already published and available. But in India, it's being published on the 1st of July, but you can still buy it. You can pre-order it. Hopefully, once bookstores like Kitab Khana and such start up delivery, I know Kitab Khana is talking about it, they will be able to deliver as well.
And we have one final question, or two a little bit on Parent Captain.
A fascinating individual who, again, deserves her own study. Parent Captain was one of those 8 grandchildren who I was talking about. There were, amongst those 8 grandchildren, I believe 5 were daughters, and I think 3 were sons. And of those 5 daughters, 3 were known as the Captain sisters because they married 3 Captain brothers. That was kind of the thing to do in that era, right? A group of brothers married a group of sisters. And Parent Captain, along with 2 of her sisters, Goshi and Nargish, were involved in political activities for the Congress. Both Nargish and Perrin were originally involved in much more radical circles. I mean, as I mentioned, Perrin was involved with people like Savarkar and Madam Kama. But by 1915, they pretty much all came to Gandhi's side. So Parent Captain was one of the most important female Indian leaders in Bombay, aside from someone like Sarojini Naidu. She held down the fort in Bombay, in Congress House during the civil disobedience movement. She was arrested during that particular phase. She and her sisters, the 2 other Captain sisters, were involved in the promotion of Khadi. In fact, there is a kind of like a Khadi Udyog store in Nesbag that you can still go to today. I think it's called the Gandhi Seva Sabha. And that was founded by Parent Captain and some of her associates in the 1950s to kind of continue Gandhi's Khadi. So they had a very long association with the Congress. And oftentimes people like Parent Captain could be quite blunt and critical to Gandhi. Dadabhai Naoroji's habit of outspokenness definitely passed on to his granddaughters. So whenever Gandhi said something that people like Parent Captain or even the other sisters didn't like, they let Gandhi have it. So it's it can be a little fun to see their exchange when you look at their letters.
And this Perrin is a different Perrin from the Perrin Nariman Road we know in the fort.
I still do not know who Perrin Nariman is.
So a lot of people mix up and think that Perrin Nariman Road is named after the granddaughter of Naroji. Right. I have a question. Did Khurshid Naroji ever marry?
No, she never married. I have heard people say that Nehru apparently had a crush on her, and Gandhi's granddaughter was telling me that she had a crush on Naroji. On Nehru. So, maybe they had feelings for each other, God knows. But she never married. She remained unmarried for the duration of her life, and we actually don't even know when she died.
Yes. Arzan Wadia says his book came to him from Amazon, and he's waiting to dig into it.
Okay, yeah. So in the US, it is available. Abroad, I mean, here at least in India, you can order it, but it's not available as yet.
And not a question, but an observation by Vikram Singh. He says he's heard or read somewhere that his bungalow is now a building called Sea Pearl. So let's go and take a look.
That might be it. Yeah. So the bungalow is called the Sands, and I recall seeing this name, Sea World or something. And there was one building that was kind of cordoned off by a very old-looking kind of boundary wall with, I think, a statue of a lion there also. And I wondered if that was it.